Hello friends, today we will be talking about a very interesting topic, that is group dynamics. Group dynamics specifically with reference to concepts like obedience, competition and cooperation. Whenever people are in a group, there are so many interesting dynamics that evolve. We see people behaving differently when they are single, when they are standing alone, or when they are alone in a room versus when they are part of a group. Obedience is a word that all of us know right since our childhood. We have been exposed to the concept of obedience through our scriptures, through the way we are raised at home. So what is it we are talking about when we say obedience? In the context of psychology, when we use the word obedience, we are talking about a major social influence in which one person directly orders one or more people to do things in his or her way. So obedience involves direct orders from a person of authority. Obedience is actually less common than some of the other phenomena, say like conformity behavior. But obedience is also fairly widely prevalent in interpersonal interactions. When we receive a command from a person of authority, we tend to follow their diktat. We tend to follow whatever they tell us to do. And we are also reluctant to go against whatever they say. Let's say there is a professor or a teacher in a classroom. When the teacher issues an instruction, the students follow automatically. A parent at home, a father says something. The child may or may not like it, but the child tends to follow the instructions. So obedience is a form of expression where you do what someone tells you, irrespective of whether you agree with it or not. One more interesting thing is, once people reach this position of power, followers are very reluctant not to listen to them. That is, they would like to follow, they would like to show obedience to authority. They are willing to follow these orders even if it goes against their beliefs, their fundamental beliefs. Where do we find an expression of this? We find this whenever we have elections. We vote our people back to power again and again and again, irrespective of whether we are really convinced that a particular political leader has done a good job or not, irrespective of whether we are convinced of the person being able to deliver what he or she has promised. So once a person is in a position of authority, the tendency of followers is to follow and is not to cross the line, not to question the authority. So obedience manifests itself in so many different ways. If you go back in history, look at Nazi atrocities that were committed during Hitler's time. What was happening? An entire nation, a whole lot of people, thousands of people were being commanded by Hitler to act in very brutal ways, in very uncaring ways towards people who had been friends, people who had been neighbors till a few months back. Why did people agree to it? Why were the Nazi concentration camps such scenes of horror? How could people, rational people like you and me, how could they follow Hitler's diktat and obey whatever he said, not questioning his authority? The whole thing boils down to the concept of obedience, how human beings react when they are in a group, and how this entire thing plays out whenever people see or interact with a person at a position of authority. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist, a social psychologist, a researcher who was interested in studying how obedience manifests itself. So what he did was he conducted a series of experiments. These experiments were conducted in Yale University in the US, and this was way back in 1960s. This was not, we are not talking about experiments that happened very recently, we are talking about experiments that happened almost half a century back. What does that show? It shows that the concept of obedience, this entire phenomena is something inbuilt in human behavior. It's part of human behavior. It's not something new. It's not something that just we see, observe or actually go through. So what were Milgram's experiments about? His experiments were actually quite simple. There was a situation where there was a teacher and a learner. Okay? So the minute we say a teacher and a learner, what does that convey? Teacher has a position of authority. Teacher is the more knowledgeable one. Teacher is the one who can have some kind of power on the other group, that is the learner. And the experiments were called studies on the effect of punishment on learning. So what they told the subjects was, the participants were told that we are going to conduct some studies and we are going to study the effect of punishment on learning. Now there was a experimental situation, a setup where both the teacher and learner were taken. The teacher was told that there will be a set of questions. The teacher will be given a set of questions and he or she has to ask the learner these questions and the learner has to answer. Simple, the situation is very simple. Teacher asks questions, learner has to respond. Now, this is where the concept of punishment was introduced. If the learner gives the correct answer, fine. What happens if the learner gives an incorrect answer? When the learner gives an incorrect answer, the teacher was supposed to take an action. What was the teacher's behavior supposed to be? The teacher was supposed to administer a shock to the student, okay? An electric pulse. What happens when you touch a live wire? You get shock. So similarly, whenever the student was giving an incorrect answer, the teacher was supposed to administer a shock. Now there was a contraption, an instrument which was placed in front of the teacher, which had a dial and a lever. When the lever is turned on, the shock will be administered. The dial had several markings on it, starting from 15 right up to 450. This was the voltage, 15 volts right up to 450, 15, 30, 45, so increments of 15. So whenever you turn the knob, turn the dial and set it at say at 30 and pull the lever, a shock of that magnitude will be administered. So 15, 30, 45, 60, it went on like that, went on increasing right up to 450 volts. 450 volts, which is pretty dangerous, which can take a man's life, which can cause irreparable damage. Okay? So the shock that would be administered to the student can range right from 15 volts to 450 volts. Now the teacher was instructed that whenever there is an incorrect answer, you administer the shock and also increase the degree of shock by one level. So the first time a wrong answer was given, an incorrect answer was given, the learner was administered a shock of 15 volts. The second time it was raised to 30 volts. The third time 45 volts and so on and so forth. So as many mistakes, the degree of shock keeps increasing. So this was the setup which was explained both the experimenter and the teacher, and this experiment was carried out with several people. There were several participants, several teacher-learner combinations. What Milgram expected was, they expected that during the study, people at some point would probably refuse to obey to administer the shocks. And they were also wondering how many people would actually go through the whole thing and administer shock right up to the level of 450 volts. Now, the initial levels were marked as slightly dangerous, somewhere in between was dangerous, around 300 extremely dangerous, 450 volts extremely dangerous, 450 volts was marked by 3 X's, which showed that it could create potentially dangerous, it could have dangerous consequences in terms of even having an effect on the life of the learner. Okay. So, not only were the dials marked with numbers, it was also written in text saying that this level is slightly dangerous, up to this level is dangerous, then further is extremely dangerous, and then you have a triple X level. So, the teacher knew not only the amount of shock to be administered, but also its possible impact. Now, as the experiment progressed, as the questions were read out and as the answers were given, for every incorrect answer, shock was being administered and the dial was being turned. Now, from the learner's point of view, what was happening? As the shock level increased, the learner was experiencing discomfort. When the shock levels reached 90 volts, the participant actually started screaming in pain. They were having a lot of discomfort and they were screaming out in pain, and the teacher could actually hear that the participant was experiencing a lot of pain. When the shock levels reached 150 volts, the participants started yelling, "I don't want to be part of this experiment anymore, please let me out. I don't want to do this anymore, it's hurting, it's painful, let me go." At that point, some of the participants were looking at the experimenter for some guidance, were asking, were kind of checking out, what do we do? Do we continue? Do we stop? The experimenter told them to go on, and the teacher went ahead by administering a higher degree of shock. By the time this reached 180 volts, what was happening? The participants were finding it so uncomfortable that they were banging on the walls. They were requesting to stop it and they were banging on the walls. Then eventually, when it reached 300 volts, the learners stopped answering. They were under excruciating pain, they were having a lot of discomfort, they were no longer shouting and yelling, they were begging, "Please let us out, we don't want to be here, please let us out, we don't want to face this anymore." At that point again, some of the participants who were in the role of teachers, tried to ask the experimenter, and when the experimenter said, "Please continue, go on with the experiment," they went on administering right up to 450 volts. Now, in this kind of a situation, if we were in this kind of a situation, what would we do? Would we continue? Would we stop? Let's remember that the participants in this experiment were as innocent as you and me. They also were not really aware of what exactly was happening. They only knew what the experimenter told them. So, as far as the participants were concerned, both the teacher and the participant were told that shock is being administered, and for the teacher, the shock that he was administering or the shock that she was administering was very real. He was actually administering a shock to the level of 300 volts, 400 volts, 450 volts. Now, what Milgram and his students wanted to see was how many people would actually obey the experimenter and take things to that level, actually administer shocks right up to the level of 450 volts. At the beginning of the experiment, they had kind of surmised, they had conjecture that probably 2% or 3% would agree. The rest would not agree, would at some point say that no, we cannot go ahead, we cannot administer such high levels of shock to people. Do you know what the actual result showed? It showed that 26 out of 40 participants actually went ahead. Okay, something close to 65% actually went ahead with the whole process and went on to administer shocks up to the level of 450 volts. Milgram was very surprised, very even shocked with the kind of results the experimenter showed. In spite of knowing that administering shocks at that level could have serious physical impact, could cause damage physiologically to the learner, the teacher was obeying the commands of the experimenter. Why do you think this has happened? In Milgram's experiment, he used participants from a wide age group, right from 20 years up to 50 years. And if you look at the demographics, the background of these people, about 40% of them were unskilled workers, people who had a basic high school education. Another 40% were white collar workers, and 20% were professionals who were highly qualified, who had college education, who had probably done courses like engineering, medicine, or auditors, chartered accountants, lawyers, okay, highly qualified people who spent a lot of years of study, who had a lot of knowledge about the impact of administering a 450 volt shock. And despite that, the experiment showed that people were willing to obey and go right up to that level. Why did this happen? Why were people willing to obey despite knowing that it is probably going to even result in a life and death situation? Why would people do something in a group context or would obey when there is a person of authority, when they won't do the same thing if they are all alone, if there is no pressure of obedience? This was the question they wanted to address. Now, some critics said this is probably because they were in an experimental setup. They were told that this is a professor, he is researching something, and this is an experimental setup, people sitting there. So, the responsibility of the actions was not lying on the participants. The onus of ensuring that people are safe has shifted to the experimenter. So, people saw that the teachers, people in the role of teachers probably saw that there is an experiment sitting here, he will ensure that there is no danger to the participants. So, that probably spurred them on, that probably pushed them to continue the experiment right up to the levels of administering 450 volts. And some others said that probably the location had an impact. This was being conducted in a university, a very prestigious university, Yale, which continues to be one of the top 4 universities in the world, and by a top-notch professor. So, probably the settings also, the location also had an impact. So, the next round of experiments took all these comments into account. What did they do? They shifted the location to a very rundown, dirty looking, scary looking building, and they did not reveal that they were researchers, professors conducting an experiment. They simply asked participants to play these 2 roles without revealing who they really were. And they also varied several other aspects of the experiment to see if this obedience was as a result of that exclusive situation of being conducted in the context, in the premises of the university campus, or is this a more universal phenomena. So, in the first situation, the experimenter's presence was varied. In one case, the experimenter was sitting just a few feet away from the teacher. In the other case, the experimenter walked in every now and then, gave instructions and walked off. He was not sitting in the same room. In the third case, the experimenter was not seen all through the experiment. Only his voice was heard. So, three different situations. Then the results showed that whenever the experimenter is present right there, when there is a physical presence of a figure of authority, the degree of obedience was much higher. People obeyed much more when the experimenter was sitting right there, as opposed to when the experimenter was not seen at all, or when the experimenter kept walking in and walking out with instructions. So, that was one result that the study found. When the person of authority is present in the premises, in the vicinity, the degree to which people obey is much higher as compared to when the person of authority is not seen or heard in the immediate vicinity. The second variation that they looked at was having 3 teachers to 1 learner. So, there were 3 teachers sitting, asking questions and administering shock to incorrect answers. Now, what the experimenters did was, what Milgram did was, he had 2 people as confederates. 2 people were his own people who were acting on his instructions. The third participant was the naive participant. The third participant was the one who just walked into the experiment, probably like you or me, like we would walk in when someone says, could you please participate, we are conducting an experiment. Okay? So, he was a naive volunteer. Now, why 3 people? The idea was to study how the impact of pressure would work when there are 3 teachers. How would obedience vary if when there are 3 teachers as opposed to 1 with an experimenter. So, in this case what was happening, instead of the experimenter telling them to continue, the other 2 teachers were telling the naive participant to continue with administering the shocks. Also, all 3 of them could hear the participant screaming in pain, banging the walls once the shocks reached a particular level. But these 2 people were apparently not affected at all, not concerned about participants' reactions. In such situation, the degree of obedience once again was pretty high, but it depended also on how well educated or the degree of education of the participants. When the participant was highly educated, college educated, what they found was that obedience was lesser. They tended to question authority. They tended to question whether these 2 teachers were right, as opposed to when the participant was not college educated. So, probably education, the level of education had a role to play in the degree of obedience elicited in these kind of situations. There was another variation that was also introduced into the experiment. In this case, the distance between the teacher and the learner was assessed, whether this had an impact on the obedience shown by the teacher. In the first case, there was a remote feedback situation, as in there was an isolation booth and the learner was placed in the booth, and the teacher could neither hear nor see the learner. So, in the remote feedback situation, the learner was placed in a remote environment, he was isolated, and the teacher could not hear or see the impact of his or her actions. So, there was no immediate feedback when the teacher is administering, say, a 300-degree volt shock. How is the learner reacting? There was no information to the teacher. The second situation was a voice feedback situation. In this situation, the teacher could not see the learner, but the teacher could hear the learner's voice. The teacher could hear the learner shouting out in pain, asking to be released, begging not to continue the experiment. Okay, this was the second situation. The third situation was the proximity condition. Proximity, as the word itself is self-explanatory, the teacher could both see as well as hear the learner. The learner was placed close by. So, the teacher could actually see the reaction of the learner instantaneously. So, both were placed in the same room in this condition. The fourth condition was called the touch proximity condition. In the touch proximity condition, not only was the learner very closely situated to the teacher actually had to grab the student by the hand, grab the learner by hand and force him to touch the shock plate so that the shock could be administered. So, 4 different situations which tried to study whether the distance between the teacher and learner had an impact. What do you think would have happened? Obviously, the study found that there was a direct link between the distance between the teacher and the learner and obedience level. The closer the learner was, the obedience shown by the teacher was higher. So, as the distance decreased, obedience level actually went up. In fact, Milgram reported that the subjects were very obviously undergoing discomfort. They were stressed out, they were sweating, they were showing signs of panic, they were yelling out in pain, they became tense and they were engaging in nervous laughter, all visible signs to show that the learner is experiencing discomfort, various degrees of discomfort. Despite that, the study showed that the teacher demonstrated obedience behavior to a much larger extent than expected.